He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the smoke drift upward in a slow gray ribbon above a city inside a city. The guide said it was the River Rouge complex, and that everything needed for a car moved through these buildings as if a river had been turned into iron and fire. Isoroku Yamamoto listened in careful silence and tried to take notes without losing sight of what was in front of him. Ore cars rolled beside coal cars that rattled toward blast furnaces. Pig iron poured in bright streams. Steel slabs moved on rollers with a steady thrum. The floor shook, and the light changed with every furnace door that opened. He had first seen America during his Harvard years, and again as a naval officer attached to the embassy in Washington. The train to Detroit had been crowded with workers holding lunch pails and the morning paper. Now he smelled coke and oil and hot metal and heard 100 little sounds under the main roar. A crane lifted a stack of frames and a whistle blew, and a man in a cap shouted a number that vanished into the noise. He wrote one word in his notebook: scale. Then he added another line: from ore to engine under one roof. He tried to keep his face calm while his mind raced ahead to ships, aircraft, fuel, and what this sight could mean if this country ever decided to arm for war. The foreman who walked him along the railings repeated figures in the calm voice of a man who had said the same things many times. 30 square miles of property with buildings on a vast fraction of that. More than 90 buildings inside the complex. Power plants on site. A fleet of company-owned boats. Internal rail lines that ran for many miles. Tens of thousands of workers on shifts that overlapped so that production did not sleep. The visitor nodded and asked short questions. How much iron per day? How many tons of steel per month? How many engines per shift? The answers came in steady measure. Hundreds of tons moved as input. Trains of coal that fed the furnaces. Tens of thousands of engines each month in later years when new models came on. He tucked away the voice and the numbers and tried to join them in a picture. He had learned English well enough to follow every word, and yet it was the rhythm that struck him. He watched frames become chassis, and chassis become finished machines. At one crossing, he had to wait as a long chain of models crept forward, still dull and unfinished, like a regiment before it receives its colors. The guide smiled and explained that even the glass was made here, and pointed to the high buildings where sand and soda moved up through lifts to be melted and rolled into sheets. The visitor thought of battleships and carriers. He had trained as a gunnery officer and then turned to aviation. He knew the weight of armor plate, the thickness of deck steel, the hunger of turbines that eat fuel day and night. He looked at a river of parts and tried to see aircraft engines, ship turbines, tank tracks, bomb, racks, field telephones, and all the metal that connects them. A morning in Dearborn could be told as one man looking and writing as the light turned from the pale blue of early October to the hard white of noon, but it also belongs to a broader story that stretched across the country during that decade. The United States had built more automobiles in a single year by the late 20s than many nations owned in total. Annual car production climbed into the millions. The Rouge complex alone held its own coking plants, its own ore docks, its own rolling mills, and fed assembly lines that could deliver a finished car in a time measured by hours rather than days. Detroit reached out through suppliers in many states. Rubber arrived from the Gulf ports and rail yards. Copper for wiring came from mines far to the west. Glass sands moved in trains. The Michigan state lines were crossed by the shipments of paint, instruments, bearings, and tools that tied a continent together. Labor moved too. Immigrants from Europe, Migrants from the American South and farm boys from Michigan towns stood at presses and lathes and learned a language of gauges and calipers. The speed of output kept rising with each change in layout. The great factories adjusted and learned to squeeze seconds from each station. When the Model T ended in mid-1927 and the Model A came, the city changed its heartbeat and then found a new readiness that mattered in more serious years. This was not a secret to foreign visitors. Attachés, engineers, and officers walked the same catwalks and listened to the same numbers. They sent cables and letters home. They tried to explain that what looked like a car city was also a lesson in how to make anything once the drawings were ready and the rails were clear. He left the mill catwalk and passed into a space where engines came together. Blocks and crankshafts and valves slid into place with a hiss and a click, and a test bench coughed to life. He stood with his notebook open and tried to imagine a row of aircraft engines where these car engines ran. He raised his eyes and watched belts move. He felt the small change in the air whenever a door to the outside opened. His body remembered the smell of bunker oil and salt air, and he measured everything here against the needs of a fleet. He knew what it meant to keep aviation fuel clean. He knew the time it took to repair a hole in a carrier deck and the labor that lay behind a fresh propeller or a new pump. A man at a bench tightened bolts with calm hands and slid the finished unit along to a waiting cart. The visitor spoke quietly to the guide about electricity. The guide pointed to a powerhouse chimney and said the plant made its own power and that the complex could run even if the city grid failed. The visitor wrote the word redundancy. He asked about the number of shifts per day. He asked if production could be expanded. The guide, proud and careful, explained that the company had done so before, that it had moved from one model to another without stopping forever, and that when demand rose, the lines simply ran longer and more often. The visitor nodded and put his pencil away. He had seen enough for one morning. Outside, trucks moved with crates and men in caps waved and shouted. The air felt cool after the heat inside. He looked back and tried to hold the image in his mind for as long as possible. He would carry it with him for years. He did not know what wars the future would bring. He did know that whatever came would meet this kind of power if this nation ever decided to fight. The reports arrived on Yamamoto's desk, bound in plain brown folders stamped confidential. He read them late into the night under the dim light of his office lamp at the Navy Ministry. The American automobile industry had doubled its output since his visit to Dearborn. In that short span, the United States had become the world's largest producer of steel, oil, and machinery. He compared charts that showed the tonnage of American merchant shipping, the production of raw aluminum, and the number of aircraft engines produced annually. The numbers rose like steps on a ladder, each year higher than the last. He wrote a short memo to a colleague, stating that America's real weapon was not its army or navy, but its factories. He had studied naval strategy, but now he studied economics, rail networks, and energy production. His mind returned often to the memory of those endless moving lines at the River Rouge complex, where raw ore became an engine in a matter of hours. He had seen discipline and order, but also a freedom of invention that Japan's tightly controlled industries lacked. The United States did not rely on central orders from a ministry. It relied on the will and competition of companies driven by scale. Yamamoto realized that a war against such a machine would not be won with courage alone. Outside his office, Tokyo's streets buzzed with the sound of trucks, rickshaws, and the occasional imported American car. Japan's industrial growth was impressive by regional standards, but tiny compared to the American scale he had seen. The Osaka Iron Works produced steel measured in tens of thousands of tons per year, while American plants produced in the millions. Japan's total annual automobile output was barely equal to 1 week of Ford's production. The Mitsubishi shipyards in Nagasaki were proud of their battleships and carriers, but their tools were old and their machinery often imported from Britain or Germany. Coal shortages forced factories to close at night. Yamamoto walked through the naval yard one morning and watched men hammer rivets by hand into the hull of a new cruiser. The sound echoed through the harbor. The work was skillful and proud, yet slow. The shipyard smelled of oil and salt, and every worker's face was marked by fatigue. He thought of the Ford workers who had used hydraulic presses and electric cranes to build faster, safer, and without stopping. The Japanese yard was a world of sweat and hammers, while America's was a world of switches and steel arms that never tired. He wrote quietly in his notes that industrial strength was as decisive as guns. Across the Pacific, events in America confirmed his fears. The Great Depression had brought hardship, yet the American industrial base remained vast. When Roosevelt launched the New Deal, it did not dismantle the factories, it modernized them. The Tennessee Valley Authority built dams and power stations that electrified rural areas by the hundreds of miles. The Civilian Conservation Corps built roads and bridges, expanding the arteries of commerce. The Works Progress Administration put millions to work, keeping industrial skills alive. Yamamoto studied the statistics. In 1933 alone, America produced 24 million tons of steel, while Japan managed less than 3. The automobile industry recovered quickly, and new assembly methods spread beyond Detroit to plants in Ohio, Illinois, and California. The technology of mass production was no longer confined to cars. It reached aircraft, trucks, engines, and even household goods. This ability to adapt and convert was what worried him most. In his report to the Navy General Staff, he wrote that if Japan ever fought America, it must do so quickly, decisively, and before the enemy could awaken its full capacity. He underlined the word industrial 3 times and closed the folder. Few of his superiors understood his urgency. By 1937, war had already begun in Asia. Japan invaded China, and its armies advanced across the plains of Manchuria. In Tokyo, newspapers printed images of victory and maps colored with expanding frontiers. But in the back rooms of the Navy Ministry, officers like Yamamoto worried about the arithmetic. Every bullet, every shell, every tank required steel and oil, and Japan imported most of both. He had once admired American freedom and innovation. Now he feared them. He read new intelligence reports describing the expansion of American aircraft factories. Douglas, Boeing, Lockheed, Curtiss, names that had become symbols of speed and power. The United States produced thousands of planes each year, even in peacetime. By contrast, Japan's total production capacity was in the hundreds. He saw that America's automobile plants could be converted to military production faster than Japan could build new factories. He had seen with his own eyes that a factory designed to build cars could, with minor changes, build anything made of steel and aluminum. Tanks, bombers, or engines, it was only a matter of time. As he folded the latest report and looked out toward the gray Tokyo Bay, he realized that the war Japan was preparing for would not be decided by admirals or generals alone. It would be decided by men in factories thousands of miles away, men who had never fired a gun but who could make one every second. The harbor shimmered with heat as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stepped onto the deck of a visiting cruiser, watching the American coastline in the distance. The United States Pacific Fleet was stationed at Pearl Harbor, a name he would come to know too well. He had been assigned as the commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet, and though his face betrayed little emotion, his thoughts churned like engines below the surface. He had been in Washington a decade earlier and had met many American officers, but this time his observation was sharper, heavier with purpose. Intelligence reports from naval attachés in Los Angeles and Seattle filled his briefcase. They spoke of expansion, of shipyards in California and Puget Sound running at double shifts even in peacetime. The United States, without a formal declaration or mobilization, was already building the foundation of wartime production. Yamamoto noted the statistics. By the end of 1939, the United States possessed the largest industrial base in the world, producing over 47 million tons of steel annually. Japan, by comparison, produced barely 7. In Detroit, far from the Pacific waters, the gears of another kind of war were already turning. Henry Ford's factories, joined by General Motors and Chrysler, produced more than 3 million vehicles a year. The production lines that Yamamoto had once studied as a young officer had grown even faster and more sophisticated. In Highland Park and Willow Run, vast hangars were being planned for new models of aircraft. Workers spoke of the machine that builds the machine, a phrase that haunted his strategic imagination. America had learned to multiply its strength not by soldiers, but by engineers. Assembly lines that once built sedans could be retooled to build bombers in a matter of weeks. The same presses that stamped car fenders could stamp the panels of a B-24 Liberator. The automotive industry was not simply a business anymore. It was an arsenal in waiting. Yamamoto's aides handed him reports from trade journals and American newspapers. Ford and General Motors had begun accepting defense contracts, quietly at first, then openly by 1940. Each month brought new blueprints for trucks, engines, and aircraft components. The scale was beyond anything Japan could imagine. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto addressed senior naval officers during a classified meeting at the Naval Staff College. He spoke calmly, but the message was grave. If Japan were to go to war with America, he warned, they must strike with such devastating force that the Americans would lose the will to fight before their factories could fully awaken. He cited the numbers. America has the capacity to build 10 aircraft for every one of ours. They can replace a battleship faster than we can build a destroyer. Some officers scoffed, believing that the Japanese spirit, the Yamato Damashi, would overcome the material imbalance. Yamamoto shook his head. Spirit alone cannot build engines. It cannot forge steel or refine fuel. He proposed a war that would begin and end swiftly, perhaps within 6 months. Anything longer would be suicide. But his warnings were not fully heard. Many in Tokyo still believed America was a nation of luxury and soft men, dependent on comfort and convenience. They had not seen what he had seen in Dearborn. They did not understand what it meant for an entire city to breathe in rhythm with machines that never stopped. As 1939 gave way to 1940, the world darkened. Europe burned again, and the Nazi blitz over Poland and France revealed how industrial war had changed. The United States remained neutral, yet its factories were already feeding Britain and France with ships, planes, and weapons. The Neutrality Acts bent under pressure as Roosevelt's administration began the Lend-Lease policy. Shipyards in New York, Philadelphia, and San Francisco began running around the clock. The Ford Motor Company, still officially civilian, began assembling aircraft engines. In a single month, American shipyards could turn out more merchant tonnage than Japan could in a year. Yamamoto watched these developments from across the sea. His intelligence officers in California sent back coded cables listing ship departures, production figures, and steel deliveries. Each message confirmed his deepest fear. The Americans were preparing for a scale of war that could not be matched. He studied maps of the Pacific, tracing distances from Hawaii to Japan, from California to the Philippines. He knew that geography and timing were Japan's only temporary advantages. He turned to his aide one evening and said quietly, "If I must fight America, I will run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But after that, I can give no promise of victory." He woke before dawn and lay very still, listening to the small sounds of his house. The town outside Tokyo breathed in a different rhythm than the factories he had watched in Dearborn. In the quiet, he read the latest coded dispatches again, the numbers and locations written in the clean hand of naval clerks. Pearl Harbor had been struck. Ships and men had been lost. The reports listed the names of carriers and battleships, the number of aircraft destroyed on the ground, and the count of sailors and airmen missing. He folded and refolded a single photograph. It showed rows of planes on a Hawaiian field with dark scars where fire had burned the tarmac. He felt the photograph in his hands as if it were the sound of something breaking. He remembered the feel of the River Rouge catwalk under his feet, the smell of hot metal and oil, and he tried to connect that memory to the reality that now lay before him. He had planned an attack that he believed would buy time. He had believed in the impact of a sudden blow to the enemy fleet. He had hoped the shock would be so great that Washington would seek a negotiated peace. Now he read the casualty lists and the initial damage assessments and tried to measure what he had actually done. He felt a mixture of calm and sorrow in the old way of men who knew the cost of decisions. He wrote a short line in his private notebook that read like a note to himself. "We struck hard. Now watch the consequence." Then he walked outside and watched the sky where carrier birds had come and gone only days before. The air felt ordinary and too wide to hold the grief he knew was spilling through the islands and the Pacific. The wider picture had already begun to move in directions he had feared, and in directions he had hoped might not be possible. The United States had been shaken by the strike at Pearl Harbor. The American public reacted at first with grief and fury. Within days, the nation that had argued about neutrality and aid to others now gathered itself and declared war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke with a voice that reached across the nation and summoned an image that would come to define the American response. He called the nation to be the arsenal of democracy, to turn its factories and its resources into the tools that would save free peoples everywhere. That phrase began to organize a vast energy. The industrial machine that Yamamoto had seen in the 20s and studied in the 30s now became a concentrated instrument for war. Car factories quiet for the Great Depression were soon full of men and women learning new patterns of work. In the months after December 1941, the capacity of American industry expanded with decisions and investments that multiplied output on a scale that shocked observers. Plants in Detroit and across the Midwest were given contracts worth billions of dollars. Roofs were raised, new concrete poured, and assembly lines altered to accept different parts. Willow Run, the great bomber plant outside Detroit that would become a symbol of mass production in wartime, began to take shape as long hangars rose and conveyors were planned to move fuselages. The Liberty ship program gathered steam and would produce thousands of vessels to cross the oceans. Government agencies coordinated supply, transport, and raw materials in ways that made a single mindless phrase true. The United States mobilized. The question was how fast and how much. He watched the aftermath with a close attention that was both strategic and personal. He read reports from the front in the early months of 1942, and he tried to imagine how the enemy would recover. He remembered the faces of small town men who had driven trucks between plants, and the way their hands moved on a steering wheel. He had once believed that striking the fleet might make the Americans pause. Now he saw that the pause might become the beginning of a new form of making war. He penned notes about timing and logistics. He understood that aircraft carriers were not merely floating airfields. They were platforms that could be replaced, given time and raw materials, and that aircraft themselves could be built by tens of thousands of workers working shifts. He tried to envision menus of replacement, a map of the enemy's capacity to rebuild. He had studied the Ford plant layout and the way tools were organized. He pictured presses and dies remanufactured, presses set to stamp parts for tanks and engines. He tried to imagine how many factories could be converted in 6 months. He thought about the supply chain that ran from the copper pools to the wiring shops, from aluminum smelters to propeller shops. He measured in his mind the time it would take an island nation constrained by imports to match a continental power with coal, iron, oil, and vast labor reserves. In his diary, when he allowed himself to write plain sentences, he recorded a fearful acknowledgement about scale and the cost of prolonged conflict. He held that thought like a small stone in his palm and felt its weight. Across a vast map, the American industrial system reorganized itself into a war economy with a speed that would surprise almost everyone who had watched it grow slowly during the interwar years. Auto manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler converted production lines to produce trucks, tanks, aircraft engines, and other essentials. Ford applied the methods used to build cars to build bombers. The Willow Run complex, planned in 1941 and running in 1942, would become the site where heavy bombers rolled off the line. At peak times, the plant would be associated with the production of one B-24 every hour and a fraction of an hour, a fact that stunned foreign observers. The United States Maritime Commission put in place a Liberty ship program that used standardized parts and prefabrication to assemble a merchant vessel in record time. Shipyards that had once produced yachts and cargo ships now worked 3 shifts to fill convoys crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific. Steel mills pushed out plate and beams in quantities counted by millions of tons. Women entered factories in numbers previously unseen as the official workforce expanded. The whole nation became a system that could absorb losses and replace hardware at a rate that turned tactical victories into strategic challenges. Yamamoto and other planners had always known that industry mattered. They had studied diagrams and lists of tonnage. What surprised many of them was how quickly parts, plans, and people could be organized into production lines once political will and financing were applied to the problem. The United States had learned to think in volumes and in months rather than in units and in years. He traveled often between staff rooms and forward observation posts, and his notes grew darker in tone as sterile figures and warmer stories accumulated in his file. He read letters from sailors that owners of newspapers would not publish, and he read snapshots of burned hangars. He also read cables that described enemy convoys already being formed on the other side of the ocean. He tried to maintain a sense of proportion. An attack could win a battle or a campaign, but not necessarily the capacity of an industrial giant to re-equip and fight again. He reflected on the role of morale in both countries, and he tried to measure it alongside the factories. Japanese sailors and aviators fought with skill and bravery, and the damage done at Pearl Harbor was strategically meaningful. Yet his understanding of the enemy had grown beyond ships and guns to include an appreciation for raw capacity. He wrote in his diary that a nation that could feed armies and fill docks and repopulate its production lines with new workers was in a different category of power. He noted that the American government had organized priorities that funneled steel to shipyards and aviation plants, and that the question was how to slow and disrupt the flow of raw materials. He ordered reconnaissance, but also asked for diplomatic notes to consider whether certain trade routes and supplies might be cut. He understood that the war would be decided not only by battlecraft, but by the ability to manage resources over years. He had been a sailor who loved the sea and the precise language of tactics. Now he had the uncomfortable task of thinking like a manager of nations. The American response to the shock of December 7th moved with a mixture of emotion and practical planning that would translate into scale. The Office of Production Management, and later the War Production Board, set priorities and worked with private industry to allocate steel, copper, and aluminum by need. Contracts were placed for thousands of aircraft and for hundreds of thousands of trucks and jeeps. Shipyards were ordered to expand slipways and to use modular construction to speed assembly. Aluminum smelters ran at higher rates. The country opened new mines, accelerated rail construction, and rationed key goods to keep the supply chain moving. Labor practices changed. The experience of the Depression faded as unemployment dropped and factories sought workers. Women and minority groups who had been excluded from industrial jobs found positions on assembly lines and in shipyards. The social fabric of the nation changed as the workforce diversified. Training programs taught new skills in a matter of weeks. Technical schools and on-the-job instruction produced skilled teams that could run presses and lathes and rivet guns. The result was not instantaneous, but it was fast. Production numbers rose month after month, and the inventory of the armed forces swelled. In the Pacific, the presence of numbers mattered as much as the skill of sailors and airmen. Yamamoto had hoped that a devastating initial strike might change the will of the United States. Instead, it unified a people and turned their manufacturing might into a blunt instrument of war. The long-term cost of fighting a peer with that kind of production power now loomed over every Japanese plan. He stood on the flag bridge of the flagship Akagi on the morning when the sea seemed to glow under a wide sky. The fleet moved in formation, each ship holding its place with precise geometry learned in the long hours of training. Below him, the carrier deck crew worked in practiced rhythm. Engines coughed to life. Bomb racks were secured. Pilots climbed into cockpits and waited for the signal to launch. He watched them and felt the familiar ache behind his ribs that came from responsibility. He had once been a young officer who thought only of gunnery and air maneuvers. Now he carried the weight of a plan that would decide the future of his nation. The battle for Midway had begun, and with it, the turning of the war in the Pacific. He stared at the thin horizon line and thought not only of tactics, but of the machine that waited beyond that line. He tried to imagine the ships under construction in San Francisco Bay, in Bremerton, in Norfolk. He could not see them, but he knew they existed. He had read enough intelligence reports and memorized enough shipyard schedules to know that every day of this war meant new hulls sliding into American water. He watched the first wave of aircraft lift from the deck and vanish eastward. The rising sun made their wings gleam. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and prayed that the sea would be merciful. The battle that followed would become one of the central events of the Pacific War. The Japanese fleet came to Midway with 4 carriers and a plan to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers. It was a gamble, bold and sharp. Yet in war, a single turn of luck or timing can change generations. American codebreakers had read parts of the Japanese plan, and Admiral Nimitz moved his forces accordingly. The battles that had been fought at sea since Pearl Harbor had taught both sides that carriers, not battleships, would shape the war. Air groups launched and fought beyond the range of guns. Torpedoes and bombs carried the violence across miles of open water. Hours passed as scouts searched and formations maneuvered. When the American dive bombers finally found their mark, they struck fast and with precision. Flames rose from decks that held fuel and armed aircraft. The shock was not only physical, it was emotional. He learned of the hits on the carriers Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi in quick succession. He read the messages without visible reaction and asked for the status of the air wings. He read again the words that confirmed what he already felt in his bones. Fire had taken hold. Damage control crews fought, but the flames fed on oil and aviation fuel. He gave the order to withdraw the fleet. He knew that what had been lost could not be rebuilt in time. The sea rolled on with its usual calm and gave no hint of the change that had come. The documentary history of the war would later describe Midway as the point where initiative passed from one side to the other. In the narrow sense, that was true. The loss of 4 carriers and many trained pilots weakened Japan at a time when it could not afford such a blow. Yet the deeper truth, seen from the vantage of Yamamoto, was that Midway revealed the brutal logic of industrial war. Aircraft carriers were not symbols. They were tools. Tools can be replaced if a nation has the capacity. The United States had finally begun to awaken that capacity. American yards were building new carriers of the Essex class that would enter service in growing numbers. At the same time, new fleet oilers, repair ships, and escort carriers were under construction. The bomber plant at Willow Run increased output each month. The number of aircraft rolling out of American factories climbed into the thousands. General Motors produced Allison engines. Pratt & Whitney filled crates with radial engines. Curtiss-Wright sent propellers by the ton. Rail lines moved components to coastal assembly points. Shipyards used prefabricated modules to cut construction time. The effect of these changes was simple and terrifying. Losses could be replaced. Sunken ships would be followed by new keels and new crews. In the first 6 months of the war, American industry had been disorganized. After Midway, it began to operate with a clarity of purpose that would define the rest of the conflict. Midway did not end the war. It opened a door that led into a long corridor filled with factories, cranes, and melting furnaces. For Yamamoto, the months after Midway were filled with reflection. He read letters from officers who mourned dead comrades and cursed the fate that had turned the battle. He wrote back to them and urged calm. He told his staff that courage was still required, that Japan still held strong positions across the Pacific, and that the fleet would fight on. Yet in his private papers, he admitted a truth few wanted to see. Japan could no longer match the rate of enemy production. Every zero lost would take men and time to replace. The Americans would lose a Wildcat or a Dauntless fighter and receive new aircraft from a freight train days later. Japan built aircraft in the hundreds. The United States built aircraft in the tens of thousands. Japan launched a few large warships each year. The United States began launching several a month. This was not a contest of wills alone. It had become a contest of output. He remembered again that morning in Dearborn. He remembered the line of engines sliding forward, each one nearly ready for a waiting chassis. He saw now that America had turned that same process onto war. Machines were being built with the same logic that had made the automobile a tool of the common person. Repetition, simplification, and scale now ruled the battlefield as surely as admirals and generals. He wrote a final note in his diary before turning in for the night. He wrote that the sound of war was no longer only the blast of guns. It was also the low, endless hum of factories that worked without pause. He sat with his staff in a low room that smelled of paper, ink, and tobacco, and he asked for the newest tables to be placed in front of him in a clean stack. The clerks had copied, columns of figures by hand from intercepted radio traffic and from public statements carried by American newspapers that reached Tokyo through neutral ports. The numbers did not argue. They simply rose. Aircraft production in the United States had reached tens of thousands per year by the end of 1942 and was rising toward a figure that seemed unreal to anyone who had lived through the thin years. Yamamoto traced a forefinger down a column that estimated American bomber output and paused at a line that mentioned a plant outside Detroit, where large four-engine aircraft would soon be leaving the floor at a pace faster than most shipyards could lay a keel. He closed his eyes and saw again the steady crawl of a conveyor at River Rouge, the way a blank frame became a finished car through simple repetition. He asked his aide to read aloud the report on Willow Run. The aide spoke quietly and said the line was expected to reach a speed that would produce one B-24 in a time measured by a single hour and a fraction. The room fell silent for a moment. He understood it without any show of surprise. The logic of the assembly line that he had watched years before had now been tied to machine tools, jigs, and fixtures built for war. He asked for the tables on merchant shipping and listened to the story of the Liberty Ship program, where steel sections were welded together in blocks and cranes swung entire parts of a ship into place like toys. He heard that American yards had learned to shave days and then weeks from each vessel, and that the fastest of them could launch one inside a week when all parts and teams were ready. He thought of the sea lanes that fed Japan and of the long, thin lines of supply that ran down toward the Solomons and New Guinea. He pressed the paper flat with both hands and felt its stiffness fight his palms. Then he spoke in a quiet voice that everyone in the room could hear. If the enemy has decided to turn all of Detroit to the making of war, then it is not Detroit alone we face. It is the force of a continent flowing through one city and many like it. The broader map of 1943 was changing with a speed that made even the most seasoned officers pause when they looked from battle reports to factory reports. The United States had moved from slogans to a system that linked raw ores to finished machines by way of power plants, railroads, truck fleets, classrooms, and a hard new discipline on factory floors. One set of figures told a plain story. American steel output ran into tens of millions of tons each year by 1943, enough to feed ships, tanks, guns, and the rails that carried them. Aluminum production had been pushed to levels that were rare even in peacetime, which meant airframes could be built in numbers that had once sounded like errors. Chrysler ran the Detroit Arsenal tank plant and turned out armored vehicles in long rows. General Motors devoted plants to aircraft engines and gearboxes. Ford learned to build wing sections and fuselage parts with carmaker discipline. Women took places at rivet guns and drill presses in thousands, and the rhythm of the day changed across Michigan and Ohio and Illinois as the clock for a shift pulled families into a new life. Training programs taught workers to read gauges and to keep tolerances in thousandths of an inch, and the simple fact of that training showed up later on the sea lanes when convoys sailed with more escorts than they had months before. The shipyards of the West Coast filled in a calendar that once had been a peacetime chart. Seattle, Portland, Richmond, and San Pedro measured progress by hull numbers and by mooring lines cut and dropped. The Maritime Commission listed the count of new freighters and tankers by the hundred, and those hulls carried aviation fuel, steel plate, trucks, and food in quantities that turned distant islands into supply points with reserves. Yamamoto read these wide reports and always returned to one idea. The war was now a contest in timing. If Japan could not force a decision before the full weight of these systems reached the front, then the front itself would move like a tide that could not be pushed back. He stepped out of the office and walked along the veranda to clear his head and met a courier who had brought personal letters from the front. One of them had come from a young Navy pilot who had grown up near Osaka and had written of a dogfight above a strip of coral where the air smelled of burned oil and salt. The pilot wrote with pride, but also with a tired hand. He asked for more engines, more spares, more fuel of the kind that ran clean in the heat of noon. He asked if there would be more carrier decks to send them to the line. Yamamoto folded the letter and knew that the boy had written to the wrong man, but he also knew that this kind of letter belonged to a larger ledger that did not lie. He returned to the maps and placed markers for Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and the long log of the Solomons where both sides had fought by night and by day for control of airstrips and the waters around them. He remembered the early months of the war when Japan had moved fast over wide spaces. He also remembered that he had warned superiors that time would not be their ally. Now time had a sound. It was the sound of presses and cranes in a river town where smoke rose every hour. It was the sound of an American worker tapping a gauge and nodding to a foreman before moving a bomb rack down the line. He had once written that he could run wild for 6 months. That line had crossed the desks of men who liked to see bold words on paper. Now he thought of the next 6 months and the 6 after that. He asked for summaries of American aircraft losses for the past quarter and compared them to American production for the same period. The math did not care for pride. When losses in the Pacific could be measured by the hundred, while production at home reached into tens of thousands, he could see how the curve of the war would bend. He did not give speeches on this point. He wrote short notes and he moved ships and air groups as well as he could, but the curve remained. The documentary frame around his private thoughts widened each week, and every new figure out of Detroit made that frame heavier. Reports from the Office of War Information and from the War Production Board were printed in large type so that even a quick glance told you what mattered. Automobile plants had been fully converted. Civilian car production had fallen to near zero, which meant the tools and labor once used for sedans and coupes had all been turned to vehicles that moved men and supplies across battlefields. The bomber plant outside Detroit did not simply produce aircraft. It organized thousands of suppliers under a timetable that let engines, instruments, tires, glass, and wiring unite at the right hour. That timetable then sent complete bombers by rail to distant fields, where crews learned their machines by touch and sound. What shocked many foreign observers was not only the speed of assembly inside a plant, but the speed with which the entire network learned to solve problems. A shortage of bearings in one state could be met by a change in quotas and transport schedules in another, and the change would ripple through the network in days rather than months. This was the kind of quiet strength that did not show up in a single battle report, but that decided wars across seasons. On the water, the Liberty ships multiplied until convoy diagrams were thick with dots. Each dot was a ship loaded with food, fuel, parts, and men. On the rails at home, boxcars moved in long lines, and switching yards worked all night under hard white light. The city that had taught the world how to make millions of cars had now taught itself to make the tools of war in the same way. When Japanese generals read captured pamphlets that bragged about an aircraft every hour or a freighter in a week, many of them shook their heads in disbelief, then anger, then in a silence that came from an honest respect for power. Yamamoto did not waste energy on disbelief. He had seen the root of it with his own eyes in a Michigan autumn. He set down his teacup, called for the weather report for the Northern Solomons, and told his staff to prepare the orders for a concentrated strike that would try to disrupt the enemy timetable, rather than chase after each new piece of hardware that came off an American line. He knew that he was not facing a single plant or a single shipyard. He was facing a nation that had turned its knowledge of making into the art of making war, and the speed of Detroit was its clearest sign. He boarded the transport aircraft with a small staff and without ceremony. The jungle air at Kahili Airfield lay thick and damp over the metal skin of the Mitsubishi G4M bomber. Mechanics moved away as engines turned and the propellers blurred. He had made flights like this many times, moving between bases that marked the edge of the Japanese perimeter in the Solomons. Yet this flight carried a weight that reached beyond strategy. The war had entered its second year. The early advance had stalled. The enemy was now pushing. He had written letters home that said little of what he truly believed. He had written reports to Tokyo that spoke of stubborn defense and new plans.